July 31st, 1986. Silver Spring, Maryland. The body of 19-year-old Keith Warren is found in a wooded area, hanging from a tree in a noose. Even though there's some unexplained discrepancies and suspicious behavior from the authorities, Keith's death is ruled to be a suicide. Nearly 6 years later, Keith's mother receives an envelope containing photos of the crime scene, which show that Keith was found dressed in clothing that did not belong to him. This leads to new discoveries suggesting foul play, including the presence of toxic chemicals in Keith's system, and the suspicious death of an acquaintance of Keith's who may have had information, but no conclusive answers are ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering one of my most highly requested cases, which I've been wanting to tackle for a long time, the unexplained 1986 death of Keith Warren. As you probably know, due to the recent events which have been taking place in the world, I decided that every Trail Went Cold episode I released in late June and all of July would explore an unsolved cold case in which the victims were persons of color. So we're going to close off this month with the harrowing story of a young African-American man whose death was ruled to be a suicide, even though he was found hanging in a noose from a tree. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this case from Unsolved Mysteries, and it's one of the more high-profile cases from that show, which I have not yet done an episode for. Unsolved Mysteries featured a lot of segments about cases in which a victim's death was ruled to be a suicide, but there were enough suspicious discrepancies to convince their loved ones that it was murder. In some of those cases, you got the sense that it may have actually been suicide all along, and the victim's family was desperately searching for answers because they had a hard time dealing with their grief. However, Keith Warren's death probably has more red flags than any of the other Unsolved Mysteries suicide cases, particularly when you consider the circumstances of how his body was found, which resembled a lynching. Things escalated years later when an unknown person anonymously left an envelope containing crime scene photos on the doorstep of Keith's mother, which left her more convinced than ever that foul play had taken place. Sadly, Keith's mother has since passed away, but his sister still advocates for him and runs a website called Justice for Keith Warren, which contains a number of the original case documents and is the source for a lot of the information you will hear on today's episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unexplained death of Keith Warren. Our story begins in Silver Spring, Maryland in 1986, and our central figure is a 19-year-old African-American resident named Keith Warren. Keith spent the early part of his childhood living in Durham, North Carolina, but following the divorce of his parents, Cleo Warren and Mary Cooey, Keith and his young sister Sherry made the move to Silver Spring alongside their mother. The family currently resides in a suburban townhouse, and after spending his high school years as a popular, well-liked student, Keith has just recently graduated. In fact, he is planning to return to Durham in the fall in order to attend North Carolina Central University. On July the 29th, Keith received a phone call and left his home in a used blue Corvette, which he had recently received from his father as a graduation present. He was supposedly going to hang out with friends, but when he failed to return by the following day and did not call anyone, his mother became concerned. Mary called a number of Keith's friends, but none of them knew where he was, and when she attempted to contact the Montgomery County Police Department, she was told they could not file a missing persons report for Keith until he had been gone at least 48 hours. Well, on the evening of July the 31st, Mary was working her shift as a pathologist at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center when a Montgomery County police officer named Luther Leverett stopped by to share some horrible news. Keith had been found dead in a wooded area only a couple hundred yards from his house. At approximately 1:30 p.m. that afternoon, a young woman named Claudia Michelle Lawson called 911 from a residence in Silver Spring and informed them that a suicide had taken place inside their basement. Emergency medical technicians from a fire and rescue station were dispatched to that location, where they met up with Lawson and two other young males, one of whom was Lawson's boyfriend and resided at the house. Lawson now claimed that the suicide had actually taken place in a wooded area and that she had stumbled across a body while walking her dog. Lawson agreed to escort the EMTs to the scene, but did not provide any explanation for why she initially said the suicide took place in the basement. When the EMTs arrived at the location, they discovered the body of Keith Warren hanging by a 40-foot-long rope from a tree with a noose around his neck. Officer Leverett soon arrived at the scene, along with the county's deputy medical examiner, Dr. John Rogers, and they did not see any signs of struggle or foul play or any noticeable bruises, cuts, and abrasions on Keith's body. Even though Keith had not left any note behind, his death was immediately ruled to be a suicide. Mary was left absolutely shocked and devastated by the news, but it wasn't long before she started noticing discrepancies which made her suspicious. A detective named James Beasley had arrived at the scene and would have ordinarily taken charge of the investigation, which included notifying next of kin. However, it was Officer Leverett who attempted to track down Mary Cooey, and when he found out she wasn't home, he spoke to one of Mary's neighbors and showed her a piece of identification he had found on Keith's body so she could verify he lived there. Even though the neighbor attempted to provide Leverett with Mary's work number and offered the use of her phone to call Mary, Leverett declined and simply asked the neighbor to tell Mary to call him at the station. The neighbor soon contacted Mary to pass along the message, but in spite of making numerous attempts to contact him, Mary was unable to reach Leverett until he showed up at the medical center to inform her about Keith's death. And by this point, nearly 6 hours had passed since the discovery of Keith's body. Mary was also surprised to learn that instead of sending Keith's body to the morgue or the medical examiner's office to be identified by next of kin, Leverett had arranged for Keith to be sent directly to Colin's funeral home without notifying her. Mary contacted her brother and asked him to visit the funeral home to identify Keith, but he would be denied entry on multiple occasions. He was eventually informed that he had to bring Keith's legal guardian along with him in order to view the body, even though Mary was heavily sedated by this point. Mary and her brother did not get to see Keith until 24 hours after his body was discovered, and they would soon learn that the funeral home had already embalmed him without asking for the family's authorization. Shockingly, no autopsy or toxicological tests were performed on Keith before he was embalmed, and no real investigation was performed into his death. The wooded area where he was found was never sealed off as a crime scene, and very few people were interviewed. The official medical examiner's report from Dr. John Rogers had some odd discrepancies, as it listed Officer Leverett as the individual who pronounced Keith dead, even though he was not a trained medical professional. The report also contained the sentence, quote, "His sister stated she hadn't seen him for about a week." Well, this information was completely false, since Keith's sister Sherry had been visiting her aunt in New Jersey at the time of Keith's death, and she never spoke with anyone from the police or medical examiner's office. Strangely, Keith's death certificate listed his date of death as July the 30th, 1987. Obviously, they got the year wrong, but since Keith was found on July the 31st, and no autopsy or lividity test was ever performed, how could anyone be certain that he died on July the 30th? In another odd detail, Keith's Corvette was found parked in a residential neighborhood in front of a community clubhouse about a quarter of a mile away from the wooded area, even though there were a number of other available parking spots which were much closer. When Keith's personal effects were returned to his family, they were inside a duffel bag he had taken with him when he originally left the house. It contained some cassette tapes, along with some items of his clothing, including a hooded jacket, his hat, and a pair of brown boots. The rest of Keith's clothing had been destroyed by the funeral home, supposedly because the level of decomposition on his body had completely deteriorated them. Oddly, Keith's effects also included 2 empty cartons for a 4-pack of wine coolers which had supposedly been found near his body. But while a pair of wine cooler bottle caps were found in the pockets of Keith's pants, no actual bottles were found at the scene. The situation became even stranger when Keith's family spoke to a friend of his named Rodney Kendall, who had been summoned to the scene where Keith's body was found and asked to formally identify him. According to Rodney, he had been hanging around outside Keith's townhouse about a week prior to his death when a group of young African-American males drove up in a vehicle and asked if he'd seen Keith. When Rodney said he hadn't, the men drove away, but Rodney had no idea who they were and found it strange that they were looking for Keith, since most of Keith's male friends were white, not black. On July the 30th, the night before Keith's body was found, Rodney had a similar encounter with an acquaintance of Keith's named Mark Finley, who drove up next to Rodney while he was walking down the street and told him that he urgently needed to find Keith. Once again, Rodney did not know where Keith was at that time, but everyone found the situation to be odd, because even though Keith and Mark knew each other from school, they were not friends, and Keith's family did not recall Mark ever having called or stopped by their house. Prior to his death, Keith had started hanging around with a rougher crowd, some of whom may have been involved with drugs, so Keith's family began wondering if this might have played a role in his death. Since Rodney had been present when Keith's body was found, Keith's grandmother asked if he would accompany her to the site so she could say some prayers for him. However, when Rodney took her to the scene, he was surprised to discover that the tree was now gone and there was nothing left but a stump. When Mary contacted the police to inquire about this, she claimed they responded very rudely, saying things like, quote, "Yeah, we cut it down, what do you want us to do about it?" The explanation provided by Detective Beasley was that the tree needed to be taken as evidence, but Mary found this odd, since they immediately ruled Keith's death to be a suicide and closed the case. While the rope which Keith had been hanging from was handed over to Mary, she never received the actual noose that was around his neck and would later be told it had gone missing. However, even though Mary had a lot of issues with the suicide ruling, Keith's father Cleo was willing to accept it. According to Cleo, Keith always had a difficult time dealing with the divorce, and the relationship had become strained over the years. In 1985, Keith had been living with his father in North Carolina, but after a heated argument with Cleo and his current wife, Keith wound up being hospitalized at the Duke University Medical Center for an anxiety disorder. Following his release, he subsequently returned to Maryland to live with his mother. I mentioned earlier that Cleo had presented Keith with a used Corvette as a graduation present, but this caused some issues to develop, as Mary did not approve of the car and feared it could attract the wrong crowd. Shortly before his death, Keith had left his job and was in the process of starting a new one, but he now had a $2,000 car insurance payment, which was due at the end of the month. While Cleo acknowledged that the police could have done a better job investigating his son's death, he was willing to concede that the stress of these events could have prompted Keith to take his own life. In spite of her misgivings, Mary was able to move on with her life for the next few years, but everything would change on April the 9th, 1992, the date of what would have been Keith's 25th birthday. That afternoon, Mary returned home to find an envelope on her doorstep, and when she opened it, she was horrified to discover that it contained 5 pictures of Keith's body hanging from the tree. Each picture was an official crime scene photo which had been shot from a different angle, and Mary had never seen them before. The biggest revelation from these photos was that Keith was shown wearing clothing which did not belong to him. As you recall, when Mary was given the duffel bag containing Keith's possessions, she was told that most of his clothing had been destroyed because of the severe level of decomposition. However, even though Mary had received Keith's brown construction boots, which he always wore, the photo showed him wearing white tennis shoes, an item which he did not own. In fact, when Officer Leverett handed over the boots, he specifically said that Keith was wearing them when he was found. Furthermore, none of the photos, official reports, or eyewitness accounts featured or made mention of additional items being found at the scene, such as the duffel bag or Keith's boots, so how did the police obtain them in the first place? While the envelope had been sent anonymously, a note affixed to one of the photos featured the names of 2 individuals, along with the words, "Don't worry, they will be next." One of those individuals was an acquaintance of Keith's, and the other was Mark Finley, who had been frantically searching for Keith prior to his death. Anyway, this new development prompted Mary to get in touch with the Montgomery County branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and launch a letter-writing campaign to state and federal officials. She did not trust the local authorities and wanted the FBI to review Keith's case, but they declined to do so since no violation of federal law had taken place. Mary was also put into contact with a private investigator named Joe Alercia, who agreed to work with her free of charge. When Alercia contacted the Montgomery County Police Department, they confirmed that the pictures Mary received were photos which had been taken of the original crime scene photographs. Since these pictures were kept inside a confidential file at police headquarters, this seemed to indicate that someone with inside knowledge and access had sent them to Mary, but the police could offer no explanation. When Alercia looked at the photos, he noticed that leaves were stuck to the back of Keith's shirt, which seemed to suggest that he had been lying on the ground beforehand and that someone else may have hanged him after he was already dead. For the first time, Mary was able to see the tree Keith had been found hanging from, and it turned out to be a rather small sapling, which was approximately 46 inches in diameter. The 40-foot-long rope had been arranged in a rather complex fashion, as it was anchored around the base of a larger tree and extended 25 feet to the sapling. The rope then encircled the sapling's trunk and arched up through a fork at the top before Keith was hanged from it. Keith's weight wound up bending the sapling, and he was pictured with his knees bent and his feet touching the ground, and his rear was in a sitting position only about 2 feet off the ground. And even though the police's official version was that Keith had jumped off a log in order to hang himself, no log or anything else he could have jumped off of could be seen in the photos. When Mary told the police that she wanted to see this tree, which they had cut down years earlier, she was told that it was destroyed by a fire, which had broken out in their evidence storage facility. In another bizarre detail, a shirtless man could be seen standing near Keith's body in the background of one of the photos. It struck everyone as odd that the police did not cordon off the scene and allowed a bystander like him to stand so close to the victim while he was being photographed. In addition, it turned out this same man had brought Rodney Kendall to the scene to identify Keith's body because he did not want to put his own name on the official police report. Anyway, these oddities prompted the local media to take a fresh look at the case, and when they aired a news report about the investigation, they were soon contacted by a man named Dallas Lipp, one of the EMTs who responded to the 911 call and found Keith's body. According to Lipp, he immediately got the feeling that Keith's hanging was staged and did not believe his death was a suicide, but he would be sent away from the crime scene once police arrived and took over the investigation. Lipp would later sign a sworn affidavit in which he personally confirmed many of the discrepancies found in the crime scene photos and supported Mary's petition to have Keith's official cause of death changed from suicide to undetermined. Anyway, since the anonymous note Mary received implied that Mark Finley's life was in danger, she would spend the next 2 months attempting to contact him. One day, Mary finally received a message from Mark on her answering machine, who said he would come by to see her soon, and specifically said the words, quote, "I need to unload." Well, another month passed, and Mark never did contact Mary until he wound up dead in an apparent bicycle accident. According to the Montgomery County PD, Mark was riding on a bike path during the early morning hours until he bumped into a curb, causing him to fall off and hit his head and bleed to death. They did not believe that any foul play had taken place, but members of the ambulance crew would later tell Joe Alertia that the severe damage to Mark's face was not consistent with an accident, and it looked like he had been hit by a car or a blunt object, such as a baseball bat. Alertia would also hear allegations that Mark had once admitted at a party that Keith did not kill himself and he helped hang his body from a tree. It wasn't long before Mary's car was broken into and a number of items were stolen, including the note which threatened Mark's life. Keith's sister Sherry would later say that she personally delivered the tape containing Mark's answering machine message to the Montgomery County PD before it turned up missing. Incidentally, it's also worth noting that Mary did contact the second individual whose life had been threatened in the note, but he wound up contacting the police to file a complaint against Mary. As far as anyone knows, no harm has ever come to this person. In May of 1994, Mary arranged to have Keith's body exhumed for their own independent autopsy, which would be performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Isidore Mihalakis. He would discover that abnormally high levels of toxic chemicals were present inside Keith's blood, brain, liver, kidney, and muscles. The most prominent of these chemicals was trichloroethane, aka TCE, a powerful chemical often found in glue, paint, and other solvents. Dr. Mihalakis stated in his report, quote, "Toxicological findings are incompatible with the autopsy findings, and in fact do not support a hanging diagnosis," end quote. He concluded that the TCE was likely inhaled or taken through Keith's mouth and would have severely impaired or even killed him, making it impossible for him to have elaborately tied up a rope between two trees in order to hang himself. In addition, nothing which could have potentially contained traces of TCE, such as paint cans, was found anywhere near the location where Keith was hanging. Mihalakis specifically stated, quote, "I do not believe that he would have had the ability to hang himself, and for that matter, he would not have had the ability to make the decision about hanging himself," end quote. He officially classified the cause of death as undetermined, and 4 other independent pathologists who examined Keith's body all came to the conclusion that he likely died from the inhalation or ingestion of toxic chemicals instead of hanging. The findings were presented to Dr. John Smilek, the chief medical examiner of the state of Maryland, but he refused to change the original suicide ruling, expressing his belief that the chemicals in Keith's system had likely entered his body when he was embalmed. As San Vino, a solvent which is sometimes used during the embalming process, contains traces of TCE. However, Dr. Mihalakis disagreed with this assessment, as there was no mention of San Vino in the original paperwork about the embalming from Collins Funeral Home. There were also some additional chemicals found in Keith's body, including xylene, ethylbenzene, and toluene, that were never used in any embalming solution. In spite of this, the authorities refused to reopen the investigation and change the suicide ruling on Keith's death certificate. Anyway, the case would garner national exposure when it was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in February of 1996. After the episode aired, a woman from Alabama called the show's telecenter and claimed that she had personally dressed Keith's body in the clothing he was found wearing, though she was not forthcoming with many details. In 2002, Montgomery County State's Attorney Doug Gansler made the surprising announcement that Keith's case had been reopened and a grand jury investigation had taken place. While Gansler publicly acknowledged that the original police investigation had been botched, he said the grand jury's findings into Keith's death were inconclusive. However, no one from Keith's family was called upon to testify, and they were completely unaware that this grand jury investigation had even taken place. They only learned about it when Gansler sent them a letter and informed them that a new file would be opened for Keith's case, though it would remain inactive unless new information came to light. Since the grand jury proceedings were confidential, Keith's family never got to find out what they discussed. Sadly, Mary Cooey passed away in May of 2009 at the age of 61, but Sherry Warren would continue to keep her brother's case in the spotlight. Sherry hired another pathologist named Mohammed Al-Bayadi to review Keith's autopsy report and other medical records. He specifically stated, quote, "The police and the county medical examiner missed the cause of death in Keith's case because they did not conduct the required standard medical legal investigation in his case," end quote. Dr. Al-Bayadi believed that Keith died as the result of a lethal dose of TCE and a toxic dose of an additional chemical called dichloroethane, aka DCE, which were likely mixed with an alcoholic drink that was ingested by Keith prior to his death. The presence of the empty wine cooler cartons made Al-Bayadi suspect that the drink may have been wine coolers, as their combination of alcohol and fruit juices could have increased the solubility of the TCE and DCE and masked their taste. These chemicals could have caused a violent reaction in which Keith vomited or even defecated himself, providing a potential explanation for why his body was dressed in clothing which did not belong to him and his original clothes were never found. Since the autopsy had shown no hemorrhages, soft tissue issue, dislocation, or fractures to Keith's neck, Al-Bayadi believed that the hanging was staged, and Keith was put into that position hours after he died when his neck muscles had become stiff due to rigor mortis. Around the time Dr. El-Bayadi's report was released, Keith's story would be featured in a TV special produced by the Investigation Discovery Network. It was titled The Injustice Files, and in addition to Keith's case, it chronicled 3 other separate stories involving the suspicious deaths of African-American male victims who had been found hanged. In 2014, Sherry publicly announced that James Beasley, the Montgomery County detective who originally investigated the case, had used quote-unquote hearsay from an unknown, undocumented, and unrelated source in order to have Keith's death officially classified as a suicide. Sherry had used a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain Officer Luther Leverett's original handwritten notes from the scene, which stated that Beasley had learned about Keith's prior hospitalization at the Duke University Medical Center in 1985. Beasley apparently used this information as grounds to conclude that Keith was depressed and suicidal and make the decision to send his body to a funeral home without performing an autopsy. However, since these notes were written hours before anyone spoke to Keith's mother, it's unclear how Beasley obtained this information without consulting the family. This is just one of the many discrepancies which has compelled Sherry to keep pushing for her brother's case to be reopened and for his death to be reclassified. But after more than 30 years, there are still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to Keith Warren. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Anyway, like I mentioned in the intro, out of all the cases presented on Unsolved Mysteries about suspicious suicides, this is definitely the one which sticks out as being the most problematic. I mean, even if you do genuinely believe that Keith Warren took his own life, you still have to have serious issues with how the investigation was carried out. The underlying problem is that members of the Montgomery County Police Department and the deputy medical examiner came across a young African-American man hanging from a tree by a noose and almost immediately came to the conclusion that it was a suicide. Compare that to the account of Dallas Lipp, the first responder who arrived on scene and instantly felt that something was off and there was no way that anyone could hang themselves in that position. I mean, I know we're talking about the affluent suburbs of Maryland during the 1980s and not the Deep South during the 1930s, but the actual crime scene photos of Keith's body are easily available for viewing online, and they are quite disturbing. At first glance, you would probably automatically assume that a lynching had taken place, but apparently, the authorities dismissed that idea very quickly. I've seen a number of sources state that there were allegedly a few hate crimes which took place in Montgomery County during this time period, though unfortunately, no specific details are available. Now, when you look at all the evidence, and take note of the fact that no significant injuries were found on Keith's body, I would be inclined to believe that this was not actually a hate crime, and Keith's race did not play any role in his death. Though whether it played a role in how the police mishandled this case is another matter which can be debated. It's also possible there was no premeditated murder, and Keith's death was an accident, but someone went to extreme lengths to cover the whole thing up, and stage a phony suicide scene. Now, like many of you, I'm sure, I was originally introduced to this story via Unsolved Mysteries, and on the basis of their segment alone, you're left with very little doubt that Keith did not kill himself. However, I have to acknowledge that their segment does leave out a number of pieces of information about Keith's background, which might cause you to look at things a bit differently. For starters, they make no mention at all about Keith's father, Cleo, and the fact that he accepted the suicide ruling. Over the years, Cleo declined all requests to be interviewed about Keith's case, and it's worth noting that he was once a major with the Durham Police Department, so it's not like he wouldn't have been trained to notice potential discrepancies with his son's death. The segment also does not mention Keith's strained relationship with his father, as well as his hospitalization at the Duke University Medical Center the year before, and all the drama surrounding the used Corvette Cleo had recently given him. Some of these details about Keith's personal issues can be found in the official police and medical examiner reports, which are available for viewing on the Justice for Keith Warren website I mentioned during my intro. However, the problem is that Keith's family maintains that a lot of these details were greatly exaggerated by the authorities in order to further their narrative that Keith's death was a suicide. For instance, the medical examiner's report states, quote, "The deceased was depressed last year, but his family insists this is inaccurate." To counter, the official report from Keith's stay at Duke University Medical Center is also available at the Justice for Keith website, and the word depression is not mentioned anywhere in the report. Instead, it lists Keith as being treated for an adjustment disorder brought on by the stress and anxiety from his parents' divorce. The aforementioned police report I mentioned was written by Officer Luther Leverett. Before he went to see Mary Cooey, Leverett actually visited Keith's former workplace and learned that he had recently left his job, which is odd enough on its own, since why would Leverett inform Keith's employer about his death before notifying his mother? Leverett wrote that Keith lost his job and mentioned his car insurance being due at the end of the month, but in actuality, Keith had chosen to leave his job and already had another one lined up. Leverett's report also states that Keith's father had phoned him on July the 29th to say he was coming to Maryland on the 31st to take his car away. Leverett even went so far as to write, quote, "The victim felt that his father showed no love towards him and that his father was very demanding," end quote. But once again, his family has insisted that these claims are not true and that Cleo had actually called Keith on the 29th in order to discuss transferring the Corvette's insurance into Keith's name. I mean, if you take the police's information at face value, then yes, you could assume that the threat to take Keith's car away caused him to reach his breaking point and become depressed enough to take his own life. But how much of this might have been exaggerated for the purposes of constructing a narrative for suicide? There were also things in the original reports which were proven to be lies, such as when the deputy medical examiner, Dr. Rogers, wrote that Keith's sister said she hadn't seen him for a week, even though Sherry was in another state and wouldn't have talked to anyone in authority, particularly since she was still a minor at that time. Sherry's uncovering of the original police notes, which seemed to indicate that Detective Beasley found out about Keith's hospitalization before speaking to his family, is also problematic. It's not entirely clear where exactly Beasley obtained this information, but he likely learned about it by speaking to a third party who knew about Keith's history. Or it's even possible that Beasley somehow already knew Keith's background before he even arrived at the scene. Whatever the case, the implication seems to be that learning this information influenced Beasley's decision to declare Keith's death a suicide. In other words, he came to that conclusion through unconfirmed hearsay rather than performing a proper investigation or an autopsy. In subsequent years, the state of Maryland Medical Examiner's Office would actually implement a new policy that required mandatory autopsies for suicides involving teenagers and young adults, and you can certainly understand why. It's really not clear if Dr. Rogers actually did anything when he arrived at the scene, as you get the impression that he practically just decided to rule Keith's death a suicide because the police told him to. But the big question is, was the laughable investigation into Keith's death done purely out of laziness and indifference, or was there an intentional cover-up going on here? Well, Keith's family has always been troubled by the 6-hour gap between the discovery of his body and Mary being informed about his death. Even stranger is the fact that Detective Beasley, who should have been the lead investigator on the case, just seemed to disappear during this time period, while Officer Leverett did all the legwork, attempting to notify next of kin. Even though he learned about Mary's workplace from one of her neighbors, it was still quite a few hours before Leverett actually showed up there to tell her about what happened. When you take into account that none of Keith's relatives were allowed to view his body until about 24 hours after he was found, and the funeral home went ahead and embalmed him without the family's authorization, you could easily infer that the family was being kept in the dark for as long as possible in order for someone to cover their tracks, but we'll talk more about that later on. I also want to mention that some of the other people who were at the scene when Keith's body was discovered remarked about Leverett's unprofessionalism, as he apparently could be heard complaining, quote, "Why would this have to happen on my lunch break?" And in December of 1999, Leverett would be arrested for assaulting his girlfriend and violating a protective order she had against him. He wound up pleading guilty to second-degree assault 5 months later, for which he received a suspended sentence and 2 years probation. Of course, this doesn't prove that Leverett was complicit in covering up Keith's death, but I think it says a lot about his character. Anyway, if you go on YouTube, you'll find a video titled Walk with Keith, Final Destination, which features Sherry Warren filming herself walking the entire route from the location where Keith's Corvette was parked to the wooded area where his body was found. The distance is approximately a quarter mile, and it takes Sherry around 8 minutes to walk there, and when you see it presented from this perspective, it really makes zero sense that Keith would have parked his car such a long distance away, as there were a number of parking spots which were much closer to his destination. And you also have to take into account that Keith would have had to walk this entire route carrying a 40-foot length of rope, and incidentally, I'm not sure if anyone ever verified where exactly Keith got this rope to begin with. Oh, and I guess Keith would have also had to be carrying 2 4-packs of wine coolers and presumably drank them all, but since no bottles were found at the scene, he was probably courteous enough to find a trash can to toss them into before he hanged himself. Even though those empty wine cooler cartons were returned to Keith's family, I wondered if perhaps they had been left in the woods by someone else prior to Keith's death and had no connection to this case. However, since a pair of wine cooler bottle caps were found in Keith's pockets, I have to think there's a connection. The location where Keith's car was parked is interesting because it was outside a community clubhouse, which was very close to his own residence, but as far as I know, there weren't any witnesses who recalled seeing him in the area during this time period, so it's unclear if Keith or someone else parked the car there. Another complicating factor is that we don't even know Keith's exact time of death. Surprisingly, the Unsolved Mysteries segment never mentioned that Keith had been missing for 2 days before his body was discovered. His mother said that she last saw him leaving the house on the evening of July the 29th because he was supposedly going to see some friends, but it doesn't sound like Keith provided any specifics. After that, there's a window of just over 40 hours or so in which his whereabouts are unaccounted for. Sherry Warren has written a lot of comments and online discussions about this case, and she says that Keith was a very social person who always had people calling or coming by his house. Yet during this window of time when Keith was missing, apparently no one attempted to call or stop by, and when Mary contacted any of Keith's friends, none of them knew where he was. Keith's family has admitted that he had recently started falling in with a rougher crowd and hanging out with people who were into drugs, so perhaps Keith was spending this time with friends whom his family was not even aware of. In fact, this may account for Rodney Kendall's story about the 3 black males who were searching for Keith whom he did not recognize. During the Unsolved Mystery segment, Mary's private investigator, Joe Alertia, presented a theory about Keith overdosing on an illegal drug at a party and the people who were responsible staging a fake suicide to cover up what they did. That theory does make sense, but how exactly would these events have played out? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Kurt Silva case, which has been covered on Unsolved Mysteries and this podcast. Kurt was a 17-year-old who failed to come home after attending a house party, and his body was discovered in a vacant lot 5 days later. The prevalent theory is that Kurt had some sort of fatal reaction to alcohol or drugs at the party before someone moved his body out of the house and dumped it into the lot. I can definitely see the same type of thing happening to Keith, but I do think there's a huge difference between leaving someone's body in a vacant lot and hanging their body from a tree in a scene that could be perceived as a lynching. That seems like a pretty extreme reaction to covering up an accidental overdose. I do think that the report from Dr. Mohammed Al-Bayadi does account for a lot of the oddities in this case. As you recall, a number of toxic chemicals, such as TCE, were found in Keith's system. Obviously, TCE is not exactly a recreational drug, but it can apparently create a mild feeling of euphoria when inhaled, and people have died from doing so. Believe it or not, during the 1980s, there were actually documented cases of young people who died because they attempted to get high from sniffing typewriter correction fluid, which contains TCE. I know that after performing his autopsy during the 1990s, Dr. Isidore Mihalikis expressed his belief that Keith inhaled the toxic chemicals, but I kind of prefer Dr. Al-Bayadi's theory that Keith could have ingested them after they were slipped into an alcoholic drink, such as a wine cooler. If this caused Keith to vomit or defecate on himself, it provides the perfect explanation for why his body was dressed up in clothing and sneakers which did not belong to him. Remember, the only items of clothing which were returned to Keith's family were his hooded jacket, hat, and boots, but if he was, say, at someone's house attending a party when his death occurred, then he likely would have taken these items off when he went inside and was not wearing them when he suffered such a violent reaction. If you believe that Keith's death was a premeditated murder, then someone could have intentionally poisoned his drink, and this explains why there weren't any noticeable signs of foul play, such as bruises and abrasions, on his body. Now, one of the first red flags in this case is the 911 call from Claudia Michelle Lawson, the young woman who found Keith's body and initially reported that a suicide had taken place inside a basement. It was not until after the first responders arrived that she changed her story, and now said she had stumbled across a body hanging in the woods. There has never been any real explanation offered for this discrepancy, but if Lawson actually had some inside knowledge about what really happened, you could assume that this might have been some sort of Freudian slip, because Keith had originally died in someone's basement. After all, one of the most prevalent theories in the Kurt Silva case is that after something went wrong at the party he attended, he spent the next few days recuperating in their basement until he died and they got rid of his body. According to Dallas Lipp, when he first arrived at the residence to respond to the 911 call, it took them a while to answer the door, and he thought he could see Lawson conferring with her 2 male companions inside, almost as if they had realized her error and were attempting to come up with a story to account for it. It's worth noting that Lawson's boyfriend, Chip Wynn, who resided in that house, wound up dying of a drug overdose years later, and while this detail might not have any relevance to this case, make of it what you will. Theoretically, if Keith's suicide was staged, and the people in that house had knowledge of what happened, they may have been given the task of calling 911 to report Keith's body, since their residence was close by. On the other hand, Lawson's remark about the basement during her call may have just been an honest mistake, and these people have zero involvement, but since the police did not perform a thorough investigation and question everybody, it seems like they had no issues with taking their story at face value. Now, in spite of all these troubling discrepancies I've brought up already, I don't think the case ever would have gained any traction and might be completely forgotten about today if Mary Cooey had not received the envelope containing copies of the original crime scene photos of Keith's body, and I'm sure it's no coincidence that someone elected to place them there on Keith's 25th birthday. Given that the original photos were supposedly kept in a secure place at police headquarters, someone with inside access had to have sent them, but the big question is, did they do this because they had a guilty conscience, or were they attempting to torment Mary? Well, it's easy to assume the former, because without these photos, Mary never would have had the leverage to obtain the services of a private investigator, arrange an independent autopsy, or get Keith's story some exposure on national television. But on the other hand, the note attached to the photo read, "Don't worry, Mark Finley will be next," and that does give off the impression they were taunting Mary. All that being said, if Mary had not seen these photos, she never would have known that Keith was found wearing clothing and tennis shoes which did not belong to him at the time of his death. I mean, even if you were to attempt to come up with a workable theory that Keith's death was a suicide, I just don't see how you can explain this discrepancy. I suppose one potential explanation is that since nearly 6 years had passed, Mary simply misremembered what type of clothing Keith owned. Or, since Keith's whereabouts were unaccounted for during the 2 days before his body was found, perhaps he purchased or obtained some new clothing and shoes during that time frame before he took his own life. But let's not forget that Keith's family also received his duffel bag, which contained other items of his clothing, including his jacket and boots. If by chance, Keith really did dress himself in the clothes he was wearing when he died, how did the police obtain the rest of his clothing? Apparently, they tried to tell Keith's family that they were found near his body, but the jacket, the boots, the duffel bag, none of these items can be seen in the crime scene photos. They were also not mentioned in any of the police reports, and none of the witnesses would recall seeing them there. The discrepancy between the tennis shoes and the boots is especially troubling because when Officer Leverett handed over the boots to the family, he allegedly said Keith was wearing them when he was found, even though the photos clearly show that is not the case. I suppose Keith could have left the boots and the other items inside his Corvette before he walked into the woods, but there's no documentation to indicate that police ever searched Keith's car or that they even found out where it was parked. So this suggests that some of the people working the case, such as Leverett or Detective Beasley, had inside knowledge about what happened, which is how they were able to obtain these items, and might also account for why there's an unexplained gap of several hours before anyone notified Mary about what happened. Also, Colin's funeral home told Mary that they couldn't return the rest of Keith's clothing to her because they had been ruined by the decomposition, but that explanation doesn't hold water since the crime scene photos don't show any sign of visible decomposition on Keith's body at all. They probably knew that they couldn't give these items of clothing to Mary because she would realize they did not belong to her son, and this could cause potential problems. Anyway, now let's talk about the note that was attached to the crime scene photos, which threatened the lives of Mark Finley and another individual. If you search hard enough online, you will find the name of the second person, but I'm not going to repeat it here, since as far as I can tell, he was never harmed and is still alive and living a normal life today. From what I understand, much like Mark Finley, this person was a casual acquaintance of Keith's, but not a close friend. This is pretty much the same reason why everyone found it odd that Mark was frantically searching for Keith shortly before he was found dead. During our Unsolved Mysteries interview, Sherry said that her last recollection of Mark was him and Keith getting into a fight while they were in the 8th grade, so no one could figure out why the two of them would be hanging out together. After receiving the note, Mary spent about 2 months trying to contact Mark until he left a message on her answering machine stating that he, quote-unquote, needed to unload, but Mark never attempted to contact her for another month before he died in a suspicious bike accident. Has not gotten nearly as much publicity, but from what Keith's family has said, Mark's family accepted the accident ruling and did not want to push any further. For this reason, there aren't too many details available about Mark's death, only that the paramedics who arrived at the scene believe that his injuries were far too severe to have been caused by a simple fall off a bike. There were apparently rumors that Mark had once admitted at a party that he helped hang Keith's body from the tree. It would be helpful to know when exactly this party took place, because if it occurred a short time before Mark's death, then this lends credence to the idea that someone killed him because they feared he was going to talk. I will say that if Mark had no involvement in what happened, and his death was legitimately an accident, it's quite a coincidence that it would occur only a few months after Mary received a note threatening his life and the case started generating publicity again. And I also think it's too much of a coincidence that Mark was seen searching for Keith on the evening of July the 30th, the night before his body was found, and a time period when no one can account for Keith's whereabouts. The fact of the matter is that Keith's family has admitted that he started hanging out with a rougher crowd shortly before his death, so even if Keith and Mark were not close friends, these circumstances may have led to them spending more time together, and Keith soon found himself in a situation in which he was way over his head. I used to lean towards Keith's death being accidental, possibly a fatal reaction to drugs and alcohol, and the suicide was staged to cover the whole thing up. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered why a number of people in power would go to such lengths to cover up an accidental death. Some of you might recall the episode I did a few years ago about the unexplained death of Tommy Burkett, which ranks alongside Keith's case as one of the most suspicious so-called suicides ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries. In that case, it seemed obvious that some high-ranking officials were helping to orchestrate a cover-up, but that could be explained by the fact that there were rumors that Tommy had been working as an undercover informant with the DEA, and the father of one of the individuals believed to be complicit in Tommy's death was a DEA agent. So could someone who was involved in Keith's death had connections to law enforcement or some influential people, necessitating the need for a cover-up? In many cases where it seems like the authorities are making a concerted attempt to avoid the victim's family and perform a proper investigation into their death, you get the sense that they're not acting this way because they were complicit, but to avoid acknowledging that they screwed up the first time around. I used to wonder if the Montgomery County Police Department's indifference towards Keith's family was their way of refusing to admit that they dropped the ball during the original investigation, which is why they were so adamant at refusing to change the original suicide ruling. But here, there does seem to be a concerted effort to bury the investigation and destroy evidence. For instance, if the case was already closed, why would they go to the trouble of cutting down the tree Keith was hanging from and keeping it as evidence before it was conveniently destroyed in a fire? How come the noose which was found around Keith's neck went missing? Why was there such a rush to send Keith's body to a funeral home and have him embalmed before an autopsy could be performed? How could they have obtained Keith's boots and jacket if he was not wearing them at the time of his death? Well, one theory which Keith's family has presented is that his death may have been the result of a botched sting operation. If Keith had gotten himself involved with people who were into drugs, he may have done something illegal and was arrested by the police. They may have told Keith he would go to jail unless he worked as a confidential informant for them and participated in a sting operation to catch the drug dealers he was involved with. But then something went horribly wrong, which led to Keith winding up dead, and since his family was never told about what he was doing, the police feared potential liability issues for culpability in his death, which is why they went the extra mile to uphold the suicide cover story. This kind of thing is definitely not unprecedented, as there are other documented cases of young people with promising futures being caught with drugs in their possession by the police and agreeing to work as a confidential informant in order to avoid prison time. One of the most infamous examples of this is the 2008 murder of Rachel Hoffman, a 23-year-old Florida State University graduate who was shot to death during a botched drug sting operation, which led to the Florida State Senate passing a new law dubbed Rachel's Law in order to ensure better handling between the police and their confidential informants. A more recent example is the 2014 death of 20-year-old North Dakota college student Andrew Sadek, who was arrested for selling marijuana and agreed to work as a confidential informant in exchange for having the charges dropped. Andrew eventually vanished and was found in a remote field with a gunshot wound to his head, and to this day, there is still a major dispute between Andrew's family and the police about whether his death was a murder or suicide. And of course, there is the aforementioned Tommy Burkett case, where one of the theories surrounding his death is that he was killed because he was acting as an informant for the DEA. Now, there is no concrete evidence that Keith ever worked as an informant for the police, so this theory is nothing more than pure speculation, but you can see how a situation like this might have unfolded. These other young people I mentioned had promising futures, which could have been destroyed if they went to prison on drug charges, so you can see why they would agree to put themselves in a potentially dangerous situation by acting as a confidential informant. Keith was an otherwise good kid who was planning to attend college in the fall, so if he was caught doing something illegal, I'm sure he may have felt pressured to act as an informant as well. Let's also not forget that Keith's father Cleo was a police officer in North Carolina, and given their strained relationship, I'm sure Keith would have done anything to prevent Cleo from finding out he had gotten into trouble with the law. Now, the key difference between Keith's death and the aforementioned cases involving Rachel Hoffman and Andrew Sadek is that they were fatally shot, whereas no noticeable signs of foul play were found on Keith's body. It was not until he was exhumed years later that traces of toxic chemicals like TCE were found in his system. Assuming you don't buy the explanation that these chemicals entered his body during the embalming process, then I have to agree that if Keith had inhaled or ingested them on his own, he would not have been capable of tying a rope between two trees and rigging such an elaborate setup in order to hang himself. When you couple in the fact that there doesn't appear to be a log or anything else Keith could have jumped off in the crime scene photos, then I just don't see how a suicide by hanging would have been physically possible. If Keith's death was an intentional murder, then I tend to lean towards the theory that someone slipped a toxic chemical into an alcoholic beverage he was drinking, such as a wine cooler, in order to poison him. In Dr. Albayati's report, he estimated that Keith ingested these chemicals 1 or 2 hours prior to his death, so he may not have even realized anything was wrong at first before the poison took over his system and killed him. If Keith had a violent reaction which caused him to soil his clothing, then the responsible parties cleaned him up and dressed him in new clothing before they took his body into the wooded area and staged the hanging. With the Tommy Burkett case, the names of some fellow students who were attending the same college as him were pushed around as potential suspects, but here, it's not so clear who might have been involved in Keith's death. Given the complicated staging of the suicide scene, it seems obvious that multiple people would have had to be involved. We know that Mark Finley allegedly confessed to helping hang Keith's body, but even if he was involved in the cover-up, I don't get the impression that he would have been the mastermind behind the whole thing. But what about the 3 black males who spoke to Rodney Kendall and were searching for Keith in the week prior to his death? As far as I know, they have never been identified, but it does lend credence to the idea that Keith may have gotten himself involved with some dangerous people his other friends and family were not aware of, and they were ultimately responsible for his death. Well, as I'm sure you probably guessed already, I have a hard time believing that Keith's death was a suicide, as there are just way too many odd discrepancies which cannot be adequately explained. But even if by chance Keith did kill himself, the one thing you can't deny is that the police mishandled the investigation and treated the family very badly. Believe it or not, during a meeting between Mary Cooey and Detective Beasley, in which she asked for Keith's case to be reopened, he reportedly said, quote, "If you had been a better mother, this wouldn't have happened." This is a recurring theme I've noticed in a number of these cases involving suspicious suicides, a lack of tact and sensitivity when dealing with the victim's family. Even if the ruling was correct, and the victim did actually take their own life, if you do not handle things well with the family, they're going to have a hard time dealing with the situation, and the natural inclination is to become suspicious. If the Montgomery County PD had followed proper procedure in Keith's case, gave him an autopsy, and performed a proper investigation into his death, then perhaps his family may have accepted the suicide ruling and moved on. However, the fact that someone took the initiative to anonymously deliver crime scene photos to Keith's family years later tells me that something incredibly shady was going on. Sadly, Mary passed away without getting to learn the full truth about what happened, but Sherry has taken the reins and is continuing to fight to seek justice for Keith. If by chance you happen to have any information on the unexplained death of Keith Warren, please contact the appropriate authorities. However, given how the authorities have handled this case, if you don't feel comfortable contacting them, please visit the Justice for Keith Warren website, which I will be providing a link to in our show notes. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released an episode on a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries about the controversial conviction of Steve Shores, a young resident from Chicago's South Side who served time in prison for the murder of a security guard, but maintained that he was framed by the real killers. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Elizabeth M., Kenny F., Christina L., Dryer Days, David G., Martha G., Claire D., Trisha P., Liam P., and Heather R. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.